Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you are joining us from sunny, snowy, icy Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, if you're joining us from Europe, or if you are joining us from Israel, then a beautiful good evening. It's such a delight to welcome each and every one of you to the first lecture, to the first speaking engagement of the month here at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. My name is Csaba Nikolenyi. I've been directing the Institute for the better half of the past 10 years, and I'm also a professor of political science at Concordia University. It's such a treat to share with you the knowledge, the wisdom, the insight, and the dedicated hard work of a homegrown Canadian Israeli writer, author, researcher who no doubt is familiar and whose writings are no doubt familiar to many of you. Those of you who have been reading the Jerusalem Post or the Jerusalem Reporter, several other Jewish but not just publications, no doubt recognize the name and the work of our guest today, Brandon Marlon. Brandon is a fascinating individual friend. He's a Canadian Israeli writer who not only originally hails from Ottawa, but also lives in Ottawa, and today he is joining us from the national capital. Brandon received his bachelor's degree in drama and English from the University of Toronto and his master's degree in English from the University of Victoria. His script, The Bleeding Season, won the 2007 Canadian Jewish Playwriting Competition. Brandon's poetry is also award-winning. Specifically, he won the Harry Hoyt Lacy Prize in Poetry in 2015, and his writing has been published in over 300 publications in 32 countries. Brandon has published 2 poetry and photography volumes, Inspirations of Israel, Poetry for a Land and People, and Judean Dreams. Brandon also published 2 historical reference works, Essentials of Jewish History, Jewish Leadership Across 4,000 Years, and its companion volume, Essentials of the Land of Israel, a Geographical History. I'm so delighted to tell you that Brandon is going to share with us today a summary, a presentation, and overview of this particular volume, Essentials of the Land of Israel, which, as I understand, is hot off the press. The very first hard copies have just been shipped by the publisher Valentin Mitchell from England to snowy Canada. So Brandon, I don't know if you actually have a hard copy to show us. If not, I know that you have lots of images that you can share with us on the screen. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you so much for being with us today. I am now going to turn, if not the floor, but definitely the screen over to our friend and distinguished guest, Brandon Marlon. Brandon, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Csaba. Thank you very much. First, let me begin by saying thank you to you and to the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies for your meaningful support of this book. Thank you as well for the invitation today to discuss the book specifically and the land of Israel generally. And also let me wish the Institute Mazel Tov on its completion of its first decade of activity. I wish the Institute many more decades of productivity and prosperity. With that, I do have a presentation prepared that I will now endeavor to share with you all. Can you see that? Yep, okay, great. So the initial premise that I want to put forward is simply this: history is intimately tied to geography. Learning a land's history via its geography is enlightening because physical environments shape civilizations and therefore human history. What we do and how we do it, where we go and how we get there, are largely determined by our environments. So with that overarching idea in mind, let's go on a tour of the geography and history of the land of Israel. Okay, To set the context, the land of Israel lies in Western Asia, the Near East, the Middle East, the Southern Levant, and the Fertile Crescent, and it's a sacred bridge or a nexus between the continents of Africa and Asia. It literally links the African and Arabian tectonic plates. In ancient times, it connected the superpowers or dominant civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, as well as the Hittite Empire in Anatolia and the Northern Levant. For Jewry, the land of Israel is both the promised land, an idea that comes from the Bible, specifically the book of Genesis, and the Holy Land, which also comes from the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Zechariah. Then in the non-canonical Jewish works, 2nd Maccabees and the Wisdom of Solomon. The children of Israel have an indissoluble connection to the land of Israel, nearly 4,000 years old and counting. The land of Israel is the ancestral and eternal homeland of the Jewish people, and also a land traversed, conquered, and settled by many other peoples. So when looking at the land of Israel, and in my book, one of the main subcategories are the natural features, and the key elements of that include geology, some of the highlights of which are the Jordan Rift Valley, which is a segment of the Dead Sea Transform, which in turn is part of the Great Rift Valley Syrian-African Rift. And it's an active seismic region due to the rift fault line, which produces earthquakes. Also, there are dormant volcanoes, for example, Mounts Bental, Mounts Avital. There's the Saharo-Arabian Desert Belt, which reaches Israel in the Negev, part of that belt. And also there are the unique landforms known as Makhtashim, or erosion cirques, erosional craters in English, which are only found in Israel, Jordan, and Syria, and America, and nowhere else in the world. Another key element of natural features, the soil and rock types. For example, the reddish sandy loam known as Khamra, the calcareous sandstone known as Kurkar, sandstone, limestone, dolomite, granite, basalt, which is formed from cooled lava, and another volcanic rock, scoria, as well as flint. Climate, a key big picture issue. The land of Israel extends from a subtropical arid zone in Egypt and a subtropical wet zone in Lebanon, and has an eastern Mediterranean climate. In other words, long, dry, hot summers and short, rainy winters. Rainfall increases as you travel from south to north, and other climatic factors include various altitudes and latitudes, spring and fall sandstorms known as sharav in Hebrew or khamsin in Arabic, coastal sea breezes from the Mediterranean, and inland rain shadows. For example, the Judean desert lies in the rain shadow of the Judean hills. Another key element, flora and fauna, the plant life and the animal life. The land of Israel, of course, is famous for the Shivat Taminim from the Bible, which are 2 grains and 5 fruits, namely wheat, barley, figs, dates, grapes, olives, and pomegranates. Also famous are the mastic shrub or tree, whose aromatic resin became renowned as the balm of Gilead, and balsams from the plains of Jericho. There were, according to the Bible, Asiatic lions, which roam the thickets by the banks of the Sorek Brook and the Jordan River, and as well Syrian brown bears formerly inhabited forests. Topography, this is one of the main features I focus on in my book, which refers, of course, to physical contours and natural resources. The land of Israel actually possesses a very rich and diverse topography, including mountain ranges and standalone mounts, plateaus, valleys, rivers, streams, whether perennial, intermittent, or ephemeral, lakes, both freshwater and hypersaline, seas, forests of oak and pine, oak being the most common tree species in the land of Israel, rocky and chalky deserts, and sand dunes. Regions. Within the broadest or maximal set of borders of the land of Israel, there are 18 discernible distinct regions, and I divide them in half. 9 are topographically defined and 9 are politically defined. I have offset the ones in green here. They're the topographical ones. You can further categorize the 18 regions according to the 8 in Transjordan, which is to say east of the Jordan River, and the 10 in Cisjordan, which is to say west of the Jordan River. And these are Bashan, including its subregions of Golan, Batania, Trachonitis, and Horan, as well as the district of Argov, the district of Chavot Yair, which straddles the Yarmouk River, Gilad, the central Transjordan mountainous region, and the Mishor, the tableland. In addition, there are a string of statelets, Aram, Ammon, Moab, and Edom. These were not originally supposed to be part of the land of Israel, but for various historical reasons, including the Amorite-Israelite War, which the Amorites lost, these ended up in not only the broadest borders of the land of Israel, but in the polities of Davidic Israel, Solomonic Israel, the Northern Kingdom after the division, etc. So for that reason, they are included here. In Cisjordan, we have Lebanon, Upper Galilee, including the Chorazim Plateau, Lower Galilee, which comprises 5 ridges divided by 5 valleys, and Samaria, of course, Judea, the Shpela or foothills or lowlands, divided by 6 valleys, the coastal plain, the Jordan River Valley, the Arava Valley, and the Negev Desert. Okay, so in terms of images, the first one on our tour here is Nimrod Fortress in the Golan Heights. It's originally a Byzantine site that was enlarged and fortified by Sultan Baybars of the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt around the year 1275. His royal lion emblem can still be found on site, carved into a stone, and it is well worth a visit. As you can see, the ruins are rather intact. Okay, so from natural features to the political or geopolitical features. The first and main one, of course, are borders. What are the dimensions and the size of the land of Israel? There are various sets. There's the maximal from the Nile to the Euphrates. There are 4 medial or medium sets, which I won't get into now for reasons of time. And there's the minimal set from Dan to Beersheba, which is one of the most common that you find in the Bible. These 3 sets or notions of the borders are based on 8 key verses in the Tanakh or Hebrew Bible. In addition, there are boundaries of the land of Israel's 12 tribal territories and 18 regions within the maximal borders. And so these latter are largely internal borders. Civilizations and lifeways. For example, the Hebrews or Israelites were land-based, nomadic and pastoral, then settled and agrarian. In other words, first highlanders and herders, then plainsmen and farmers. Interestingly, the Jews or the Israelites were rarely seafarers, unlike their neighbors, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Carthaginians. And why this is actually a fascinating historical question. If anyone wants to ask about it in the Q&A, I'd be glad to address it then. For now, I will continue with the international and regional trade routes. There were 5 super important trade routes through the land of Israel, namely the Derech Hayam, or the Way of the Sea, the coastal highway in English, connecting Egypt and Aram or Syria, the regional Derech Avot, or the Way of the Patriarchs, or the Ridge Route, or the Watershed Route, connecting Upper Galilee and the northern Negev Desert. And super important to point out, along Derech Avot lay the key sites of Chatzor, Megiddo, Dotan, Tirzah, Shechem, Shiloh, Beitel, Mitzpah, Ramah, Giva, Jerusalem, Beit Lechem, Hebron, and Beersheba. There's also the Way of Shur, which I have here in a gray, and that's just to indicate that sometimes it can be considered regional or international, depending on which set of borders you use. In any event, the Way of Shur connected the Negev Desert and the Nile Delta via the desert of Shur in northern Sinai and Wadi Tumalat, a defunct Nile distributary, which is in or immediately near the land of Goshen. The Derech HaMelech, the King's Highway, or the Road to Bashan in English, which directly linked the Red Sea and Aram, and indirectly linked Egypt and Mesopotamia via extensions at its extremities. And finally, Derech Midbar Moav, the Way of the Wilderness, or the Desert Route, in other words, the eastern branches of Derech HaMelech, which connected the Red Sea and Bashan. Also very important, the regional roads, for example, Ma'ale Gur, connecting the towns and valleys of Jezreel and Dotan. The Trans-Samaria Highway with its eastern branch, the Sunset Road, the Way to Beit Horon, which ran through the Ayalon Valley, the Diagonal Route, which ran north-south through the Shpela between the city of Ayalon and Lachish, Ma'ale Adumim, or the Red Ascent, directly connecting Jericho and Jerusalem via the ridge overlooking Nachal Prat, or Wadi Kelt in Arabic, which lay immediately to the north. The Way to the Jordan and the Way of the Plain, which ran in parallel to each other through the Jordan Valley on opposite sides of the Jordan River. The Way to Moab, which ran across Halashon al-Lisan Peninsula, which divides the northern and southern basins of the Salt Sea or Dead Sea. The The road to Edom, which connected southern Judah to across the Arava Valley to that region in lower Transjordan. Derech HaAtarim, or the Way of the Spies, which is the route taken by the spies during the Exodus and repatriation to the land of Israel, when they entered to scout out the land, surveil, and return to report. Ma'alei Akrabim, the Scorpion's Ascent, which forms part of the southern border of the tribal territory of Judah near the Dead Sea. The Way to the Arava, which ran in parallel to the southern border of Judah. The road to the Red Sea, which ran through the Arava Valley. Okay, so in addition, there are other geopolitical features, for example, the strategic loci. In particular, whoever controlled the trio of key fortresses, Chatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, which dominated key trade routes and or mountain passes and guarded valleys, was master of the land of Israel. In the case of Chatzor, it overlooked the Hula Valley. Megiddo overlooked the Jezreel, as still does. Gezer overlooks the Ayalon. In addition to these guarding and commanding access, they were also super important sites because the Jezreel Valley, for example, and the Ayalon, which is in the Shvela, are both massive bread baskets for the land of Israel, where they're very rich in agriculture. So if you controlled these three cities, to a large extent, you controlled the production and the distribution of food. No small matter. Key urban centers. There were 9 Jewish capitals, including Shiloh, the amphictyonic center of tribal Israel. Giva, the capital of King Saul, the first capital of the United Monarchy of Israel. Machanaim, the counter capital for Hebrew monarchs in Transjordan, where Ishbosheth, the son of King Saul, reigned, and where King David sojourned during the revolt of his son Avshalom. Hebron, the first capital of King David when he was King David of Judah, and in which he reigned for 7.5 years. He later captured Jerusalem and made it the capital of the United Kingdom of Israel when he was the king of all of Israel. And the 4 capitals of the Kingdom of Israel, that's the divided kingdom, that are sited along the Trans-Marian Highway that bridged the coastal plain and Gilad, namely Shechem, Penuel or Peniel, and Tirzah, which were the 3 capitals of King Jeroboam, and later the capital transferred to Samaria under King Omri. In addition, Mitzpah in Benjamin, as opposed to the other Mitzpahs, served briefly as the Neo-Babylonian Empire's administrative center in Judah. Likewise, Caesarea became the Roman Empire's administrative center in Judea and later a provincial capital in the Byzantine Empire. And for 88 years, Jerusalem was the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Crusader kingdom in the Middle Ages. And for 99 years, Akko was the de facto capital of the Kingdom of Acre, another pronunciation of Akko, and the successor kingdom to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And finally, polities, the key sovereign independent states in the land of Israel. Of course, the United Monarchy of Israel, the kingdoms of Saul, David, and Solomon. The divided kingdoms of Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The Maccabean realm, which was enlarged to become the Hasmonean kingdom, which was usurped to become the Herodian kingdom. The short-lived Jewish statelets during the Great Revolt and the Bar Kokhba Revolt. The aforementioned Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem in the medieval era. And of course, the modern state of Israel. No independent sovereign state was ever established in the land of Israel by the Rashiduns, Umayyads, Abbasids, Tulunids, Fatimids, Seljuks, Ayyubids, Mamluks, or Ottomans, despite more than 1,220 years of rule by Muslim caliphates, governorates, and sultanates. Here we have an image of a Teutonic Crusader site known as Montfort, which means strong mountain in French. Originally, it was a French site. Its name was changed to Starkenberg, which means the same thing in German, strong mountain. It's in Upper Galilee, or the tribal territory of Asher. As you can see, the ruins are quite large and impressive, and the site is perched on a spur overlooking the Kaziv stream. It's remote, difficult to get to, but a haunting site and well worth a visit. Okay, so I turn now to some challenges specific to the land of Israel, especially regarding toponyms or place names. There's a general principle here that I'd like to highlight, namely that in the Tanakh or Hebrew Bible, toponyms of regions within the land of Israel are usually indicated, especially in prose, via the definite article in Hebrew, in other words, ha, the equivalent of a the in English. For example, ha Bashan, Bashan extending from the Jordan River in the west to the city of Salcha in the east, modern Salchad in Syria, and separated by the Yarmuk River from Gilad to the south. Today, Bashan is in Syria, except for the Golan, which is western Bashan, which comprises the Half Moon Plateau arcing from Mount Hermon in the north to the Yarmuk River in the south, with Nachal Rukad, or Wadi Ar Rakad in Arabic, a main affluent of the Yarmuk River as its eastern tributary. Ha-Gilad, Gilad or Gilead in English, the mountainous central region of Transjordan, located between the Yarmuk River in the north and the Heshbon stream in the south, and bisected midway by the Yabok River. Hayarden, the Jordan River, which flows through the Jordan River Valley, which comprises the Hula Valley in the north and the Jordan Valley in the south. Halavanon, Lebanon, whose name derives from Hebrew Lavan, meaning white, a reference to its snowy peaks. Hagalil, the Galilee, whose upper and lower halves have distinct elevations and are divided by the plain of Ramah or Beit HaKerem Valley, connecting Akko and Lake Kinneret or the Sea of Galilee. HaSharon, the Sharon Plain or the Central Coastal Plain, whose greater boundaries are from Nachal Sorek or Nahar Reuben, which is south of Jaffa in the south, to the Zichron Yaakov Spur of the Carmel Mountain Range in the north, and whose lesser boundaries are from the Yarkon River in the south, which is north of Jaffa, to Taninim Stream in the north. So this idea of greater and lesser boundaries, as you can tell, is a running theme in Land of Israel studies. Hashfela, the foothills or the lowlands, in other words, the natural transition zone between the central hill country, the mountainous backbone of Cisjordan, and the coastal plain. The Shfela is at approximately half the elevation of the hill country, and it doubled as a political buffer zone between Judah and Philistia from the time of the judges, during which the Philistines invaded the southern coast of the land of Israel. The Shfela has 6 transverse valleys running predominantly east-west across it and connecting the highlands and the plain, namely the Ayalon, the Sorek, the Ela, the Guvrin, also known as the Tzfata, the Lachish, and the Adoraim. And for anyone who wants to memorize that, there is a mnemonic acronym that I use, a SEGLA. You're welcome to use it. HaNegev, the Negev Desert, the inverted triangle from Beersheba to the Red Sea, and Ha'arava, the Arava Valley, which originally referred mostly to the Jordan River Valley between Lake Kinneret and the Salt or Dead Sea, but later, due to a semantic shift or a change in meaning over time, designated instead the Jordan River Valley from the Salt or Dead Sea to the Red Sea. In other words, it moved from north to south. And the idea of semantic shift is something I'll be returning to shortly. Okay, further challenges regarding toponyms are eponyms and namesakes. Very quickly, eponym is simply something that lends its name, and a namesake something that borrows its name. There's a general principle here, which I phrase as civilization lends and wilderness borrows. In other words, a distinct urban site or locality gives its name to proximate natural features. For example, in this table, there is a series of sites. In every case, there's either a village or a town or a city, and it lends its name to the proximate mountain range or brook or desert or valley or pool of water, etc. So this is the norm. There are, of course, exceptions. For example, most notably, Lake Kinneret, whose name derives from kinnor, which means a stringed musical instrument such as a lute, lyre, or harp in biblical Hebrew, as opposed to what it means in modern Hebrew, which is a violin. Obviously, if you look at the Sea of Galilee, you can tell right away it looks like the shape of a harp, looks nothing like a violin. So there's also a modern exception that I identified, although it's somewhat problematic. There was a short-lived Galilean Arab city named Ash-Shogur, which took its name from the eponymous Shogor mountain range. But in fact, it appears that the Shogor range, in turn, was the namesake of the Tanaitic village of Shazor, in which are found the tombs of Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha Cohen, a famous rabbi and a figure in important Kabbalistic texts, Shimon Shazuri and Shimon ben Elazar, other Tanaim. And this town of Shazor is a modern Druze town called Sajur. which is the Arab a modified toponym resulting from Arabic sound conversion. So what you have here is a bit of a linguistic ballet between the language of Hebrew and the language of Arabic. The sequence is not definite, but to the best of my ability, it seems to have been Shazor, Sajur, Shagor, and then Ashagur. So that's interesting and a bit tricky, but there you have it. Okay, here we have an image of Gan HaShlosha, the Garden of the Three, known as Sachni in Arabic. It is an oasis based on a natural spring which lies at the foot of the Gilboa mountain range in the Jezreel Valley. It's widely believed to be one of the most beautiful sites in the land of Israel and well worth a visit. Okay, other challenges regarding toponyms concerning philology or linguistics. I return to the idea of semantic shifts. There's a simple general principle here as well, namely times change and so do languages. For example, the word mul in biblical Hebrew probably meant at the foot of or on the same side as, and not opposite or across from as in modern Hebrew. So in other words, the semantic shift here was so radical that it's now a contradiction between the original meaning and the current meaning. Theonymic shifts, changes in the worship of gods, where the god is part of a toponym, results in the change of the toponym itself. For example, Ba'ala, Ba'ala Yehuda, or Kiryat Baal, which of course contained the name of the Canaanite idol Baal, had a name change to Kiryat Ye'arim. Likewise, Mount Baal Chatzor had its name changed to Chatzor of Benjamin, which is modern Tel Azur. Now, this idea is also seen in onomastics, or the study of personal names. For example, with regard to the theophoric components in compound proper names, such as Yerubbaal, which was another name for the Israelite judge Gidon. That name was changed to Yerubeshet. King Saul's son Ishbaal had his name changed to Ishboshet, and King Saul's grandson, who was lame and spared by King David, Merib-Baal, had his name changed to Mephi-Boshet. So in each of these three cases, Boshet, which means shame in Hebrew, is used to excise the Baal from the previous name. Now, the rest of this slide is pertains to construct states and dual forms. I won't go through it all for reasons of time, but I do want to just give the general principle and maybe a few examples. The principle is that in Semitic languages, such as Hebrew, the construct state distinguishes. So let me pause here just to explain that the construct state, as opposed to the absolute state, is the inflected form of nouns that are dependent on subsequent nouns and signaling a genitive or a possessive relation. In other words, the first noun is possessed by the second. So to make that clear, take the Hebrew word bait, meaning house. That's an absolute state. When you transfer it to construct state, bait becomes bait, house of, it possesses. Now that's the most common construct state we see in toponyms in the land of Israel. As you can see here, many very famous sites: Beit Saida, Beit She'an, Beit She'arim, Beit Shemesh, Beit Lechem, Beit Zait, Beit El, Beit Choron, Beit Hanania, Beit Sur, Beit Zachariah, Beit Nimra, and Beit Pagai all feature this. We see this as well in Kiryah, which means a campus. Kiryah in construct state is Kiryat, as in Kiryat Arba, another name for Hebron. Kiryatayim, we have it in construct with a dual suffix. The ayim is the dual. It's a plural, but a specific plural of two, exactly two. So Kiryatayim gives us two campuses. Likewise, Ramah, which means height, and Ramatayim Tzofim is construct with a dual suffix. And this, in fact, means Ramah of the Tzufites. It refers to the hometown of the prophet and Israelite judge Samuel. I have offset here in purple several sites where the absolute state doesn't change at all when you put it in construct state. For example, Almon is Almon in Almon Diblatayma, where you have a construct with a dual and a directional suffix. The a at the end of Diblatayma means towards. So that gives us Almon towards Diblatayim, or literally the strange name of hidden towards the two fig cakes. Dibla means a fig cake. Gat, which means a press or a wine press. For example, in Gittayim, you have the dual without a construct. The T sound in Gittayim is not the construct. It's originally in the absolute state Gat. And so that gives us two wine presses for Gittayim. Also offset here in green, just to show toponyms for regions. For example, the Shvela or foothills, and the construct state is Shvelat, for example, Shvelat Yehuda, the foothills of Judah, and Galil or the Galilee, and construct is Glil, as in Glil Hagoyim, Galilee of the Gentiles or Galilee of the nations. So that's the rule. Again, there are notable exceptions. For example, Giva in construct is Givat, but Giva, Givat Binyamin, and Givat Shaul are all the same place. They're not distinguished. Likewise, Divon and Divon Gad are the same place. Kir of Moav, Kir Chareset, Kir Cheres, they're all the same place. So regarding the challenge of sites that have multiple names, we can categorize this into two subcategories, namely diachronic, which means cross time. For example, Salem, Jebus, and Jerusalem all refer to the same site, but at different periods over a matter of centuries. Likewise, Kadesh, Meribat Kadesh, Rechem, and Petra. The plain of Ramah, which is the biblical name of what we now call the Beit Kerem Valley. We can also categorize them as synchronic. For example, Jerusalem, Zion, or Zion, and the city of David, which we all use today, and all refer to the same site. Okay, other challenges. There are many sites in Israel that have the same name. As you can see here, all of these sites have at least one other place with the same name, which, as you can imagine, makes it very confusing to determine what happened where, to whom, and so forth. So again, for time, I won't be going through all of them, but I do just want to explain that the reason for this in many cases is that the place name has a generic meaning. For example, Mitzpah simply means lookout. Ramah means a height. Geva or Giva means a hill. So in a hilly, mountainous country, you can imagine why many sites have this name. I have offset here in blue a number of famous sites where you wouldn't necessarily think there's another place with the same name, but there are. Chatzor, Tzfat, Beersheva, Beit Lechem or Bethlehem, Beit Shemesh, Giva, and Jezreel, all famous cities. They all have at least one other place in the land of Israel which carry the same name. I have offset here in yellow some sites where it's actually a bit easier to tell sites apart because of reasons such as spelling. For example, I tried to capture in the transliteration the different spellings of Canaan Hebrew. It could end with the letter He or with the letter Ayin. Kana, Kana, Kana. Timna, likewise, could have a He or an Ayin. Timnata, you see here the directional suffix of A, which could mean towards Timna. Bozrah is a generic spelling for two sites, Botzra, the Edomite capital, and Bostra, which was a Nabatean city that later became a Roman regional capital in the Horan, today southern Syria. Beit Horon we can tell apart because there's an upper Beit Horon and a lower Beit Horon. It's a twofold site comprising adjoining hills. And Caesarea, we either call Caesarea Maritima to indicate the Caesarea on the coast, or Caesarea Philippi, named after one of the Herodian dynasts and located at the foot of Mount Hermon and in the Golan. Okay, here we have the Sorek Cave in the Sorek Valley in Judea, near the city of Beit Shemesh. It's a fairly large cave, features stalactites and stalagmites, including formations such as a spike that comes down from the ceiling that almost meets another spike directly coming up from the ground, and that one is nicknamed Romeo and Juliet. There's another cave coral that looks uncannily like the decapitated head of the Philistine giant Goliath of Gath, and it's a fascinating site, well worth a visit. Okay, other challenges not regarded toponyms are uncertain situations. There are certain sites, including some famous ones, where we just don't know where they are. The Yiftachel Valley, it could be Nachal Evlaim or Wadi Abalin in Arabic near Yodefat, or it could be Nachal Tzipori, known as Wadi al-Malik in Arabic near the city of Tzipori. The Eshkol Valley, where the spies found the giant clusters of grapes. It's probably Wadi Tafu, related to the Tapuach in Hebrew, which connects to the upper course of the Guvrin Valley, or Nachal Guvrin, but we're not sure. The Zered, or Zared Brook, for over a century, we identified it with Wadi al-Hassa, which is a stream that flows into the south of the southern basin of the Dead Sea. It's probably not Wadi al-Hassa, because according to the Tanakh, the Zered is apparently in northeastern Moab, and scholars misread letters of the Greek label Areia as Ared. In other words, they read a delta instead of a terminal alpha, which looks similar in Greek, and they suppose there was a missing initial Greek letter zeta or Z on the Madaba map, which gives Zared. The Madaba map dates to the reign of Emperor Justinian I and forms part of a floor mosaic in the Greek Orthodox Basilica of St. George in Madaba, Jordan. Zoar, is it by the southeast corner of the southern basin or of the northern basin of the Salt Sea? We don't know. The Tsin Desert, west of the Arava Valley in the northeastern Negev, or is it east of the Arava Valley in Edom? Not sure. Kadesh, it's probably distinct from Kadesh Barnea and east of the Arava Valley, and it might be identical with Meribat Kadesh, Rechem, or Petra, but that also is uncertain. Finally, Tel Beersheva, the ancient site of Beersheva. Is it really Tel Sheva, a distinct site, with ancient Beersheva really undiscovered in modern Beersheva, as one scholar believes? We don't know. The jury is still out. Okay, so in discussing the land of Israel, I would be remiss if I didn't address the Dead Sea or Salt Sea in a bit of focus. I'll do that very quickly. In terms of background, the Salt Sea is 34% salt, which is to say over a third. It's 1,412 feet below sea level, and it formed due to a rupture in Earth's crust when the African and Arabian plates, which I mentioned at the outset of the presentation, split apart. Later, water from the last glacial period, about 20,000 years ago, melted into the gap to form what geologists call Lake Lisan. This megalake later receded into the three natural basins of the Jordan Rift Valley floor at markedly different altitudes, forming what we know today as Lake Hula, Lake Kinneret, or the Sea of Galilee, and the Salt Sea or Dead Sea. So why is this so timely and so topical in recent months and years? Well, very simply, the contemporary problem is that the Salt Sea is receding and it's pockmarked with 7,000 sinkholes at the rate of one a day. This problem is largely man-made. It's not caused by the weather. The human factors, the primary causes, are the water siphoning of its primary tributary, the Jordan River, by both Israel and Jordan for consumer consumption and agricultural irrigation. The sea's shallow southern basin below Halashon Alisan Peninsula is monopolized by industry. For example, chemical companies, for example, ICL Group's Dead Sea Works, concentrate seawater brine in evaporation ponds from which they commercially extract minerals such as potash, which is a form of potassium, for fertilizers, bromine for flame retardants, as well as magnesium, sodium, and phosphates. In addition, the chemical companies also pump out water from and thereby shrink the northern basin to replenish their pools in the south. The problem is compounded by natural factors, namely evaporation. In a desert, of course, water evaporates. There's limited rainfall in the Jordan Rift Valley rain shadow, and there's only seasonal discharges from most secondary affluents or tributaries. So not a lot of water coming into the sea from the streams. So I have here half a dozen potential remedies that I put forward as components of an all of the above approach concerning a possible solution, namely increasing the already significant wastewater reuse and desalination infrastructure. The Red to Dead Sea pipeline, the brine pipeline, although the blended hydrochemistry may produce the crystal mineral gypsum via the Salt Sea's calcium mixed with the Dead Sea's sulfate, the Red Sea, sulfate. The combination would turn the sea white, or the hydrochemistry may render the sea red by means of massive algae. Now, these are largely aesthetic issues, but of course, we should bear them in mind. Decommissioning the national water carrier, which is a major pipeline. For practical reasons, it's more sensible for coastal plain population centers to source desal water from the Mediterranean Sea instead of fresh water from Lake Kinneret. Improved agricultural practices, for example, instead of banana plantations along the Jordan River, planting crops such as dates, olives, and flowers that can use treated sewage water and don't require fresh water, which can then remain in the Jordan River and Salt Sea. Shmitat Mayim. This idea I credit my mother with in conversation to her. It's a biblical idea that pertains to land, but here applied to water, namely a system where you have a sabbatical year each seventh, wherein water resources lie fallow and in other years are stored up or stockpiled, for example, in aquifers, cisterns, tanks, water towers, etc. And finally, stringent regulations against over-pumping by chemical companies so that private activity doesn't harm the public interest. Here we have Shifta in the Negev. Shifta is a Nabatean Arab site. It was a way station on their incense route. It sits atop a hill with orchards at the base, and the Nabatean Arabs were originally pagan. They later became Christian, and That's why we have impressive ruins at the site, including arches, as you can see. It's slightly remote, but not too bad, and will repay anyone who ventures out there. Okay, so as I close, if I can turn specifically to the book, it's a historical reference premised, as mentioned, on the physical features, divided into two subcategories, geopolitical and topographical, namely borders, capitals, mountains, valleys, rivers, lakes, seas, deserts, and forests. The layout of each chapter is that there's an original map, a chapter text, and an original photo. There's a total of 20 original maps and 17 original photos, including the front and back covers. There are 3 appendices which depict textually and cartographically the key polities of Davidic Israel, Solomonic Israel, and Maccabean Judea as well. There's scholarly apparatus in terms of the select bibliography and further reading for those who wish to pursue further resources, and an index for anyone who wishes to search the text via key terms. And finally, the book is now available in North America. It's at Independent Publishers Group. Their website is ipgbook.com. The publisher has a limited time 20% discount. The code is Marlon21, and that's valid at ipgbook.com. And in addition, because Essentials of the Land of Israel is part of a set, it's the companion volume of its predecessor, Essentials of Jewish History, you can buy them together with a limited time 30% discount, the code being Essentials2 in North America. Or if you're in the UK or the rest of the world, there's a discount ISBN number, as you see here on screen. And again, those are valid at ipgbook.com in North America or vmbooksuk.com for UK and the rest of the world. So with that, I conclude the presentation. I am happy to address any questions if there are any. And I thank you for your attention. I hope that was informative and stimulating. And I yield the screen back to you, Csaba.
Thank you so much, Brandon. This was fascinating, a sweeping magisterial overview of the topography, also the history of the land of Israel. And all of that, we are talking about thousands of years, millennia of history and topography, and all of that in 45 minutes. So, kol hakavod. Brandon, thank you so much for sharing the information about where members who are interested in purchasing the book can do so. We would, of course, be very happy to share that information later on after the conversation as well. We have about 15 minutes from the event to take questions, comments from the audience. And in order to, and let me ask our friends to please drop your comments or questions in the chat box, and I will do my best to get to as many of them as possible. Just to get the discussion on the way, I would like to fire away a couple of questions and see where the conversation takes us. Brandon.
Sure.
Walk us through about the genesis of the book. Why the topography of the land of Israel? What was it that prompted you to put together this incredibly rich encyclopedic collection about the geographical and topographical features of the land? Did you know already at the time when you wrote the Essentials of Jewish History that this would be a sequel? Did the idea come later on? What's the genesis and the history, if you will, of the thought process of this particular volume? And related to that, tell us, well, every book, every creative exercise, and you certainly know a lot about that, being an author yourself, changes you in the process of the act of creation. How have you changed? How has your relationship with the land, how has your knowledge of the land changed over the course of the period of time that you were researching and writing this book? Very personal questions, I recognize that.
Well, so to address the first one, the book is the companion volume to the original. Every big brother deserves a little brother. And so they are companion volumes. I didn't know when I was writing the first one that I would then do a sequel, but the land of Israel has long been a passion of mine. I've done a lot of hiking in the land of Israel. When I lived there, I was regularly going to all the different regions and the antiquity sites and the nature reserves. I love nature. And so it seemed to me, in terms of Jewish history, that it was one thing to learn Jewish history through the leaders, which is the focus of my first book, but you also had to know the specifics of the land of Israel. If you want to understand the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, properly, you really can't do that without being intimately familiar with the geography. And once you are, suddenly the stories make sense. And whether the patriarchs descending into Egypt, what road did they take? Or where the Philistines and the Israelites met in battle. Why were battles always happening near Beit Horon over history with the Maccabees and the Great Revolt and so on. And these become rather obvious once you know the geography, the topography, and the regions, the tribal territories, and so forth. So to understand Jewish history, you have to know the history and the geography of the land of Israel. They really go together hand in hand. In terms of your second question of how did the knowledge of the land of Israel change me, well, it certainly elaborated my knowledge of the land of Israel, how things work, how they're connected. Even today, if you want to know why certain highways are where they are in the state of Israel, excuse me, a lot of times they follow the ancient trade routes or the regional roads, and and connect key sites, key valleys, key cities, and so forth. So it broadened my knowledge base, and I definitely wanted to share the best of that with everyone else.
Thank you so much. So the chat is open. If anybody would like to ask a question, and while we are waiting for comments, questions coming in, Brandon, let me ask you about the audience. Both Essentials of Jewish History and Essentials of the Land of Israel readily lend themselves to being, as any excellent reference collection, to be used in college, university classrooms, where students can refer to look up the key concepts, names of leaders in the first volume, geographical, topographical references in the second one, in Essentials of the Land of Israel. I could easily see the book also being used by groups that are touring the country, as you said, in the Land of Israel. Where do you expect much of the audience and the readership coming from? And maybe let me nuance it by asking, did you write the Essentials books, both of them, with a lot of prior Israeli a lot of prior knowledge of Israeli/Jewish history, or is it can they be used also by the novice, by an undergraduate freshman who may not have had much prior exposure to either Jewish or Israeli history? So what prior knowledge would you say the reference collections presume?
Well, the books are written for a popular audience. I mentioned in the preface, it's for people who have little or no knowledge of these subjects beforehand. And they're written for the intelligent general reader who's interested in these subjects. I kept the scholarly apparatus to a minimum, including a few footnotes. In fact, in the newest book, there's only footnotes in the appendices and nowhere else throughout the book. It's written for the classroom and for being in the field. That was deliberate. It's useful as a text in a university course, or as a guidebook or a handbook. If you're at the foot of Mount Carmel, for example, and you want to know what happened here, why it's so interesting, whether you should make the effort to climb it or drive up there, you can take a look and see what the biblical and historical events were that occurred there. And it's really for the lay reader, and also useful for scholars who, there are specialists who will be familiar with at least certain parts of the material, but the nature of a specialist is that you know a lot about very little. And so there's a lot here that probably specialists would appreciate knowing as well. So I hope it will find a popular readership. It's meant to be on the Jewish bookshelf of every Jewish reader and Christian readers and people interested in biblical studies, Near Eastern civilizations, Middle East studies, as well as history and geography generally.
I have to say, I can't wait to get to the reading of Sefer Bamidbar and read about the journeys of the children of Israel, and then use the weekly parashiot together with your essentials, and then actually look up, okay, what are the additional nuances that we can find out about the places that we read about and that you discuss. That's wonderful. Let me just ask one last quick question from me, and there are already comments and questions coming from the audience, and I will turn to them in a moment. So I apologize for abusing the podium, so to speak. But Brandon, was there a particularly challenging part of the research/writing process during putting together Essentials of the Land of Israel? Was there a particular section? Was there a particular place? Was there a particular name, perhaps, that the figuring out the history of or the presentation of challenged you in particular? So a memorable episode, if you will, that you could share with us.
For the most recent book, it's very challenging, as I mentioned on the slide, of uncertain situations where you want to tell people exactly where something is located. And there are various scholarly views, and some are older, some are newer, some are from more conservative archaeologists or biblical scholars, some from more liberal. They have different ideological biases. And if you just want to get to the tachlis, the bottom line, it can be hard. So my technique was simply to list the options. And if there's one that really seemed more clear, I went with that and maybe gave a mention to the other site, sort of a Talmudic idea where you mention both Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. You know, I didn't want to be the decisor in case I was incorrect. But if for whatever reason it seemed to lean really in one way, I did highlight and emphasize that. In terms of challenges overall, I would just mention creating the maps for the book. These are original maps. There are 20 of them. It was a 3 to 4 month process, very painstaking and meticulous. I worked very closely with the cartographer Bill Nelson in the US, and to pinpoint exactly every site on the map, not just where they are generally, but in relation to each other. Many of them, of course, you can imagine grouped one hill next to the other in the Judean area, or in Benjamin, or in Shomron. So to get it exact and correct, the longitude and the latitude, so to speak, was very challenging. There were a lot of rounds, and I'm just relieved that it's done, and you know, hope that it will be very useful, because these maps, they don't exist. There's nothing like them. Believe me, I looked. It would be easy to license them and not have to do them from scratch. But these maps don't exist of the forests, the deserts, the lakes, the seas, the rivers, and so on, the mountains, the valleys, and they really can help paint the picture. So I do hope people understand and appreciate what a feature they are to the book.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we have a very beautiful comment from Rachel. Rachel, thank you for joining. Rachel Alkali, thank you for joining us at this event. And here is the message. Utterly fascinating. The geographical history of a country and its importance in creating the people and its history is a relatively new concept, less than 50 years old, I believe. It seems obvious that geography defines the people, but it wasn't seen so, at least until recently. So kol hakavod, Brandon, for really doing something conceptually also new and brave. A question from Tova Segal, who is, I believe, joining us from Israel. So, but of course, it's already turning evening. And the question is whether you are planning a third volume. Is there a topic that you think would lend itself for a natural continuation and sequel to Essentials of the Land of Israel?
Well, thank you, Rachel, for your comments. I would mention that, interestingly, the original historical geography of the Land of Israel really began with Rabbi Istori Haparchi in the 13th century with his work Kaftor Vaferach. He was a doctor and a rabbi who lived in Beit Sha'an. He used it as his base, and for 7 years he went hiking through the Land of Israel and wrote his book based on his research. So I definitely stand on his shoulders and the shoulders of many others in writing this work. And thank you, Tova, for your question in regards to everyone at the Modi'in Sarna Embassy. Is there a third volume? I don't have a third volume in mind, but I have already completed expansions of both books, the first book, Essentials of Jewish History, and even now I'm working on expansions of this book, adding new chapters. and emphasizing certain things that are mentioned in the first editions, but perhaps can be elaborated for a second edition. So in Mirza Hashem, God willing, there will be a second edition somewhere down the road, but that's what I'm working on now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brandon. And so in the minute remaining, let me just share two very nice comments praising you, your presentation and your work. One coming from Joseph Robinson in Montreal. Thanking you for an excellent presentation. And we are also delighted to welcome in the audience Professor Menachem Mark Rothstein, who is, of course, teaching the Hebrew classes at Concordia for several decades, and who is playing such an important role in the intellectual and academic life of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies, specifically in the Hebrew language component of our curriculum. So it's wonderful to see Professor Rothstein here, and his comment to you goes as follows. Thank you for an outstanding presentation. You have added much new information, even to those familiar with the land and its history. So it's wonderful to have this praise. Brandon, on behalf of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies, and indeed the entire audience that joined us today, and the audience that is going to join the event on YouTube once we are ready to upload it on the internet, I would like to thank you for this wonderful presentation. Really, as I said, a magisterial overview of millennia of history, social, political, geographic, and topographical. We wish you all good luck with as the new chapter in the life of the history of the book begins, of course, which is its reception. Now that your job is done, now the readers and the users are going to pass judgment. They will start using it, and we really wish you all best of luck with that as well. Ladies and gentlemen, before I would say goodbye to you, let me just share my screen quickly in order to highlight our next two upcoming events during this week and next. If you have time and interest, please join us on Thursday, February 3rd at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, when in cooperation with the Murray Gallinson San Diego Israel Initiative, we are going to bring to you Gilad Halpern, who is a visiting scholar in San Diego, and he is going to give a lecture about Israel's English language media and its Jewish American readers. If you are interested in joining the event, please send us an email at azrieli.institute@concordia.ca, and we will be setting you up with a registration at MGSDII. This is now part 2 of our new partnership with the Murray Gallinson San Diego Israel Initiative. And if you are interested, please join us next week on February 8th for a fascinating book event, book launch, by Sarah Federman, who is going to tell us about his brand new publication, The Last Train to Auschwitz, the French National Railways and the Journey to Accountability. And of course, we have so much more planned for the rest of the month of February. And of course, in the month of March, we are going to have our winter semester Israeli documentary series. So there will be more films to watch, more lectures to catch. We are always delighted to see you. Brandon, once again, kol hakavod, and thank you so much for joining us and giving us your precious time and your wisdom at this wonderful event.
Thank you so much.
Stay healthy.
Shalom uvracha.
Shalom, shalom.
Bye.